Hello guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be covering another video on the logic series I am trying to do. Today we're going to be covering the categorical syllogism, which is probably the most fundamental part in logic that you're going to have to learn if you do philosophy, because philosophy, needs logic, right? And so categorical syllogisms originate ultimately in Aristotle, right? Aristotle was the first to ever come up with a formal system of logic, but there's also other people like Stoic logic. Stoic logic tends to be another example of one of the first formulations of logic, but let's get started. So before we get into this video, we need to have some preliminary vocab. So these are just a vocab. Just know what a major premise is, a middle term, a minor premise, major term, minor term, and what it means for a term to be distributed. I mean, it's taken in its full extension. Let's get into the video. Okay, so remember, this video is taken from the textbook from Reverend Charles Coppens, the brief textbook into mental philosophy and logic. Now, in this article or chapter, he says, reasoning is the mental action of deriving judgments that are called conclusions from other judgments called premises. So there's a judgment that is a conclusion that follows necessarily from the judgment of, or the judgments that are called premises. And then so this is kind of similar to Aristotle, where he says, where you're given something supposed and what results is out of necessity, and the thing that results is the conclusion, while the thing supposed is the premises. Now, every kind of valid reasoning has the conclusion implicitly contained in the premises, deductively valid reasoning. This is the basic principle underlying every valid argument, because if the conclusion is not implicitly contained in the premises, then the conclusion doesn't even follow, right? It's not even there, right? Thus, whoever accepts the truth of the premises really then grants the truth of the conclusion. That is, if I were to accept, for example, the argument, all men are mortal, and then 2, Socrates is a man, if I accept those two premises as being true, then necessarily, therefore, I must accept that Socrates is mortal, and if I didn't, I just contradicted myself, right? Because the conclusion is implicitly contained in the premises. So if you accept the premises, you also likewise grant the truth of the conclusion. And anybody who accepts the first, oh yeah, I already said that. But reason is styled as pure if the judgments are analytical judgments, right? While reason is styled as empiric if they are synthetic and mixed. That is, if one premise is analytic and the other is synthetic. Obviously, in the last video, I think I covered the analytic-synthetic distinction. But thus, reasoning expressed in words is called argumentation. Now, let's really get into the basics of the categorical syllogism. So, Coppens says all valid arguments or all argumentation may be reduced to the categorical syllogism. And a syllogism is an argument that has 3 propositions where there is a connection that from the first 2 propositions, a third necessarily follows. So what is a categorical proposition, first of all? So something is called categorical if it affirms or denies absolutely the agreement of a subject with its predicate. For example, every S is P or no S is P. Socrates is a man. So here's an example of a categorical syllogism. All philosophers are handsome. I am a philosopher, therefore I am handsome. This is a valid categorical syllogism, even though it might not be true, but it is kind of true because, I am handsome, right? Just kidding. But the conclusion, therefore I am handsome, is implicitly contained in the first 2 premises. The conclusion here is implied by the major premise, and then it is confirmed by the minor premise. This is completely valid. Now, remember, the minor premise is the premise that contains the minor term, while the minor term is the subject of the conclusion. And thus, if all propositions are categorical, likewise the syllogism must also as well be categorical. Okay, let's look on how to actually construct a syllogism. Alright, so to prove a central claim, like for example, if I want to prove therefore Socrates is mortal, which is also known as a thesis, a central claim is a thesis, by the way, by a syllogism, we begin by first finding a proposition which involves the truth of our thesis, and a second proposition, we state that it does so. So step by step, it goes like this. Identify the claim you want to prove. Then find a proposition that implies the thesis. Then third, then state in a second proposition that it does. So if I'm trying to prove, for example, subscribing to my YouTube channel is something everyone must do, I may start with the premise, everybody must do what I command. Then I add the minor premise, subscribing to my YouTube channel is something I command. Hence, then I can validly deduce the conclusion, subscribing to my channel is something everyone must do, which they do have to, right? You know, I'm just kidding. So it goes like this. Premise 1. All things I command are things everyone must do, which also is all C is M. 2. Subscribing to my YouTube channel is something I command. All S is C. And 3. If you're wondering why it's all S is C, in my last video I covered why universal propositions can cover singular statements. And 3, subscribing to my statements about singular things. My apology. And so third, the conclusion is subscribing to my YouTube channel is something everyone must do. All S is M, which is valid, which is a Barbara syllogism, by the way. Alright, so there are also different ways a conclusion is said to be contained in the premises. First, if the major premise is a universal proposition, it may contain the conclusion in 4 distinct ways. First, if the proposition is universal, like every S is P, then the subject is only distributed or taken in its full extension, meaning that predicate P applies to everything that is S. So, yes, distributed means taken in its full extension, and that's how you know the subject is taken in its full extension is right here when it says every S is P. You can reason therefore that the predicate P applies to everything that is S, so that everything kind of gives it away. And so then if the minor states A is S, then the conclusion that is necessitated is that A is P. So the major premise affirms that a predicate belongs to a whole class. For example, if I say every gold is a metal, which means the predicate metal belongs to everything that is gold. While the minor premise affirms that a certain thing does belong to that class. For example, if I go back to the Socrates syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. All men are mortals, the major premise, while Socrates is a man is the minor premise, which states that a certain thing belongs to the class of man, right? Then the conclusion affirms that the same predicate belongs to that certain thing, and so therefore I can conclude therefore that Socrates is mortal. And now number 2, the second form or way, is that notice the change if the major premise becomes negative. For example, if I say no A is B, and in premise 2 all C is A, I can likewise conclude that therefore no C is B. And so the major here denies a predicate of a whole class, which is no S is B, means that the predicate B applies to no S. The minor affirms, and no S is B, both terms are distributed, because if no S is B, then no B is S, right? And so the minor affirms that a certain thing is of that class, and the conclusion denies that same predicate of that same being. The third form, or way, reasons that if the major denies a predicate of the whole class, and the minor affirms that a certain being has that predicate, the conclusion denies that said being is of that class. Basically, if I say no B is A, and every C is A, therefore I can conclude no C is B. Or no stone is a spirit, but an angel is a spirit, therefore no angel is a stone. The fourth form is a fourth form of syllogism, which Coppens puts it. A fourth form of syllogism arises if the major affirms some predicate of a whole class, and the minor denies that a certain being has that predicate. The conclusion will then be said that being does not belong to said class. since all the individuals of that class have been affirmed to possess that predicate. Which means, for example, if I say every A is B and then no C is B, therefore I could say no C is A. So Coppens gives the example. Every stone is matter, an angel is not matter, therefore an angel is not a stone. Right? So that's valid. In the first four forms, the major is universal. The major premise being the premise that contains the major term, while the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. And the major is universal, and it's based on the subject's extension, while in the fifth, the major doesn't have to be universal, which it derives its validity from the whole comprehension or from the full comprehension of the predicate. And in the fifth form, reasons that the major affirms that a being has a certain predicate and that it has all the notes, and by the way, notes just means knowable features here, comprehended in that predicate, while the minor affirms that a certain note is comprehended in that predicate. Then the conclusion affirms that said being has that knowable feature or said note. And this simply just means, for example, if I say this stone is matter, I'm talking about, remember, this specific stone. This stone is matter, and 2, all matter is extended, I could therefore say this stone is extended. Or all A is B, and now this is where it gets tricky, right? You might say, how is the first premise all A is B? Well, first of all, right, Socrates is a man is also a universal affirmative proposition, right? Because this stone is matter really just translates to all that is this stone is matter, right? So it goes like this. All A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C. And by conversion or changing the order of premises, the fifth form is also reducible to the first form, right? The first form is, I guess, the most perfect, right? And the fifth form is reduced. And if you look back into my other video on how to interpret the Latin moods for the table of deductions, I showed you guys how to prove syllogisms and reduce them via conversion and reductio ad absurdum. And thus, the first and second way is the most obvious ways of reasoning that are mostly used. For example, mathematics also has a similar reasoning. For example, if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then logically A is equal to C. And this is really just the first form or an application of it. Same reasoning. It is also read as any two things equal to a third thing are equal to each other, but A and C are equal to a third, B. Therefore, they are equal to each other, as Coppens puts it. And Coppens notes for the second form, two things, one of which is equal to a third thing, and the other unequal, are not equal to each other. But A is equal to B, and C is not equal to B, therefore A is not equal to C. So for example, A is equal to B, B is not equal to C, therefore A is not equal to C. In these two special modes, the major premises are often omitted because they're just kind of obvious, right? They're just there, leading to shortened arguments commonly used in practice. And many logicians reduce all syllogisms to these two abridged forms, which are affirmative and negative syllogism. First of all, a affirmative syllogism is one in which both of the premises are affirmations and is based on the principle two things equal to a third are equal to each other. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C, which is completely valid. Second, the negative syllogism is where it has one premise that is negative and is based on the principle two things, I accidentally quoted it wrong, but two things, one of which is equal and the other unequal to a third, are unequal to each other. That is, A equals B, B does not equal C, therefore A does not equal C. And comparing A with B and B with C in the premises serves to relate A and C as equal or unequal in the conclusion. And A and C, which are in the conclusion, are brought together to form what is known as extremes, or extreme terms. Now, extremes is both the major and minor term, but not the middle term. So the major and minor term are the extremes. And B is called the middle term because it connects the premises. It's the connection in the syllogism. Without it, you basically don't have a syllogism. And let's refer back to the first slide with all the vocab, right? Because you need this to understand the what Coppens is saying. Now, note that, as I've said, a major term and a minor term both are called the extremes. Now, all the propositions form the matter, what we call the matter of the syllogism, and their proper connection is what we call the form or sequence, which is different from the conclusion. Now, a syllogism is valid if and only if both the matter and form of the syllogism is not flawed. So, for example, this is materially true, but is formally false. For example, 1. All virtue is good. 2. Intemperance is not a virtue. Thus, intemperance is not good. So this is valid. This is what's it called? This is true, like actually true, but the argument is not valid here. So the reason why it is not valid, for if you guys want to know, is look at the term good. Good is not taken in its full extension, but is taken in its fullest extension in the conclusion, right? When you say all C is not B, right, or that's what it's basically saying, that no C is B, then you can likewise say that no B is C. If no C is B, then no B is C, right? And this commits a fallacy known as the illicit major fallacy, which occurs when a term is distributed in the conclusion but not in the premises. However, if it's distributed in the premises but not distributed in the conclusion, then it's still logically fine. And another example would be this one. This is materially false, so actually false, but validly true or formally true. So first is gloomy things are hateful. Virtue is a gloomy thing, therefore virtue is hateful. This is formally true since it's Barber. Oh, and by the way, Barber is the most perfect self-evident syllogisms. It's in the first figure, but it is materially false for this. And by the way, this is relating to this syllogism, so don't get confused. Now, let's look at how we criticize syllogisms. But before we start, Coppens makes a remark about the mathematical formula A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. In this, there is no error to be found because this is pretty much self-evident. The only problem here, he says, that is when we substitute the letters for ideas. For example, suppose that A equals silver, B equals a certain metal, and then C equals yellow. And then our argument goes like this. Silver is a certain metal. A certain metal is yellow. 3, therefore, silver is yellow. Well, the first of all, the conclusion obviously does not follow, right? Because silver is not yellow, right? Unless you paint it, but even then, it's not properly said to be yellow because it would only be an accident. And so the conclusion does not follow, obviously, since a certain metal is used equivocally here, so it commits the fallacy of equivocation. And silver and yellow things are different. Silver and yellow are different things. They're not said to be said of one thing only. They're two different things. Thus, Coppens puts it, to avoid and to discover errors in syllogistic reasoning, the following 8 rules must be applied. Well, let me give you a basic translation. And this really just translates, so this is the 8 rules he gives us on the top, and then it translates to this. The first rule is there must only be 3 unique terms. This is the most important rule because it virtually contains the rest. 2, the conclusion cannot have a distributed term while the premises don't. And 3, conclusions never contain the middle term. And 4, at least one of the premises must have a distributed middle term, otherwise there is no connection. And 5, there cannot be 2 negative premises since it commits the exclusive premises fallacy. And 6, sorry, my throat is dry. 6, if all the premises are affirmations, you cannot have a negation of anything. And 7, at least one premise must be universal. And 8, the conclusion has to be weaker or less primary or less general than the premises, since it is the effect of the premises. Alright, moving on. Now, we're going to talk about each rule, because it's actually really important that we lay this out. This is going to help you evaluate syllogisms, constructing them, and making sure that all your arguments are valid. So the first rule, as I've said, is the most important rule. take this rule number one because it virtually contains every other rule. And the first rule says we must only have 3 unique terms. Only 3 unique terms. And so we as Coppin says it, we evidently need 3 terms so that 2 things may be compared with a third. This rule, Coppin's notes, is commonly violated by a fallacy or by using one of the terms in 2 different meanings, especially the middle term. And he says this violation is also known as the fallacy of equivocation. Coppins gives the example here. 1. Chewing is a bad habit. 2. Chewing is necessary to man. 3. Therefore, a bad habit is necessary to man. Notice here how it's equivocating on the word chewing, which is the middle term here, since it appears in both premises, right? The middle term is the term that appears in both premises. The middle term chewing used in 2 different significations. The first premises uses the term chewing in a negative signification, as if being excessive or harmful. But in the second premise, it's used in another sense, which is a more natural sense. Thus, this is equivocating and a fallacy. And so, the second rule simply just means never let a term have a wider extension or meaning in the conclusion than in the premises, because then there is something more in the conclusion than in the premises, which is impossible, right? Remember the 8th rule that says the conclusion must be less primary or weaker than the premises. Conclusion is always weaker than the premises here, right? And rule 2 says just do not have a distributed term in the conclusion and not in the premises. So for example, you are not what I am, which is no A is B. 2, I am a man, all B is C. And 3, therefore you are not a man, which is also is no A is C. Notice here that the term man is distributed or taken in the full extension in the conclusion, right? But not in the second premise. Basically, a man is universal in the conclusion, not any man at all, but particular in the premise some man. And if you go back to how I letter each premises, you see that in the first premise, no A is B. 2, I am a man, which is all B is C. Therefore, you are not a man, no A is C. If I say no A is C, I can say no C is A because that logically converts. Therefore, A and C in the conclusion are both distributed. But notice that in the second premise, C is not distributed. So it commits the fallacy of the illicit major fallacy because C, or the term man, is distributed in the conclusion but not in the premises. Fallacy, invalid. There you go. Now, rule 3 is also simple. It's just the conclusion can never contain the middle term. Because look what happens. If I say 1, Lincoln was president. 2, Lincoln was of Illinois. And then I conclude, therefore, Lincoln was president of Illinois, which is just false, right? Read history. But yeah, that's simple rule. Rule 4 is also very simple. And it just says the middle term has to be at least taken in its full extension or distributed in at least one of the premises. Just at least one time. If the middle term were taken twice in a particular meaning, that just means not fully distributed. Not distributed. It could denote or signify different objects. For example, some monks were very learned, which is some A is not B. 2, Luther was a monk. All C is A. Therefore, Luther was very learned. Oh, sorry guys, I made a mistake in the first premise. I meant to put some A is B, not some A is not B. But please disregard that mistake. But it's supposed to be some A is B, all C is A, therefore all C is B. Notice the problem here is that the term monk is neither distributed in the second premise or in the first premise. Well, that's because if I say some A is B, then neither term is distributed. And then I say all C is A, which is Luther was a monk, but the predicate is never going to be distributed in a affirmative proposition, right? Thus, the middle term here is undistributed. Thus, it leads us to the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Thus, there is no connection between the syllogism and no conclusion can actually follow. Notice the problem that monks, as I've said, not distributed. But also, to clarify, Luther is singular terms are taken in their full extensions. For example, if I say Socrates is a man, it's also taken as all A is B, or all persons identical to Socrates is a man, or Socrates is distributed, that means taken in its full extension, but not man, right? Because if all A is B, only A is distributed, but B is not. Now the fifth rule says there cannot be two negative premises, because if two things aren't equal to a third, it doesn't mean they are equal or unequal to each other. As for example, if I say A does not equal B and C does not equal A, I cannot conclude anything from this because I cannot say whether C equals B or C does not equal B, which leads to different possibilities and just does not derive an absolute conclusion. This also is a fallacy known as the fallacy of exclusive premises. And then rule 6 is also simple. It's basically that you cannot have a negative conclusion when both of your premises are affirmations. That is, if two premises are affirmative, they declare that two things are equal to a third. As for example, if I say A equals B and C equals A, I cannot say therefore that C does not equal B. This is just obviously self-evidently wrong, and another fallacy, which is negative conclusion from affirmative premises. Alright, now rule 7 is also practically simple. It just states that if both premises are particular, no conclusion will follow at all. And the thing you have to take away from this rule is that there has to be at least one universal premise. So for example, if I say sum A is B, thus sum C is A, thus sum C is B, this is invalid because in this rule, if both premises are particular, the middle term will never be taken in its full extension in at least one premise, which is impossible since the middle term is what connects the whole syllogism, and if it's not taken in its full extension, there is no connection. Likewise, consequently, there is really no syllogism. So here, sum A is B, sum C is A, problem already right off the bat. A is not distributed in either premise 1 or premise 2 is not taken in its full extension, right? Because for example, if I say sum C is A, that means that A belongs to sum C. Likewise, I can say therefore sum A is C, where A belongs to sum C. But sum C does not tell me the full extension of C. That's why it's not distributed. Another example is sum A is B, and then let's say I switch the minor premise to a negative, and I say sum C is not A, and this I conclude sum C is not B. This is also fallacious because look how the major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion B, is distributed in the conclusion but not in the premise C's, where sum A is B. And this is known as the illicit major fallacy, where the term is distributed in the illicit major is where the major term is distributed in the conclusion but not in the premises, and it also violates one of our rules where it says that the conclusion has to be less primary or less general than the premises, right? And if it violates that, then it's not valid. So those are the 8 rules that we cannot violate. And this is a table of the distribution of terms and propositions. So for the universal affirmative, every S is P, only the subject is distributed. That is S. And no S is P, which is the universal negative, both the subject and predicate is distributed. Because if I say no S is P, then that means P belongs to no S. And I could say no P is S, therefore I could say S does not belong to any P. And some S is P, there's a particular affirmative, as I've explained. None of the terms are distributed here. And in some S is not P, only the predicate P is distributed, or taken in its full extension. Now to clarify rule 8, which is the last rule, when it speaks of the conclusion being weaker, it means if one of the premises is negative, so is the conclusion. And if one of the premises is particular, so does the conclusion also have to be particular. For example, all A is B, and I say sum C is A, therefore sum C is B. This is valid, but only the middle term is distributed, because notice that in the conclusion C and B are not distributed, but the middle term A is distributed at least once, which is in premise 1. Now these rules apply to every syllogism with categorical premises, even if the premises are made up of more than one statement, which are compound statements. So for example, if I say premise 1, God alone is eternal, and 2, angels are not God, 3, therefore angels are not eternal, therefore no C is B. So at first you can see that B, or the term eternal, is distributed in premise in the conclusion. Eternal is distributed in the conclusion, but in premise 1 it isn't distributed, because in any affirmative proposition, remember, the predicate is not distributed, and so it seems invalid, fallacious. But upon further inspection though, notice how the major premise also has a negative part, the major premise being that God alone is eternal, and it contains a negative part, meaning that it's really just the same as whatever is not God is not eternal. Hence, the rule is not violated. So it does look like it's violating the rules, but upon further inspection, it isn't. And so that's basically it for this video. Thanks for watching. The next video will be covering hypothetical syllogisms.